heavy glass door of the private study creaked open, but Elena didn't hear it. She was too busy pressing her forehead against 9-month-old Imani's, praying the child's fever would break. She was a ghost in this mansion, a cleaner who shouldn't exist in the world of Hune Kang. But as she turned around, her heart stopped. The most feared man in the city was standing inches away. Hune didn't look like the ruthless tycoon the news portrayed. He looked like a predator who had finally found what he was looking for. He wasn't looking at Elena. He was staring at the baby in her arms with an expression of haunted recognition. "She's sick," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the small space. "I'll leave, sir. Please, I was just—" "You're not going anywhere." Hune stepped into the light, reaching out to touch the baby's small, dark hand with his own pale, scarred fingers. "You're running from a man who wants to hurt you, and I'm a man who needs a family to keep an empire. Perhaps we can help each other." He looked Elena in the eye, his gaze cold enough to freeze the blood in her veins. "Marry me, Elena. I'll give your daughter the world, and I'll bury the man chasing you. But once you step into my world, you never leave. If you love stories where a mother's sacrifice meets a dangerous man's redemption, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this journey. Now, let the story begin." The city of Oakhaven was a predator that fed on the weak, and Elena was starving. At 24, she had learned that the only way to survive was to be invisible. She spent her days scrubbing the floors of people who wouldn't look her in the eye, and her nights huddled in a basement apartment where the windows rattled with every passing train. Her life was a fragile glass sculpture held together by the rhythmic breathing of Imani. But tonight, that sculpture was shattering. The call from the sitter had been the final blow. "The pipes froze, Elena. I can't take her. I'm sorry." Elena looked at her daughter. Imani's eyes were glassy, her skin warm to the touch. Elena had $6 in her pocket. If she didn't show up for her shift at the Kang estate, the legendary glass fortress on the hill, she would lose the only job that paid enough for medicine. She didn't have time to cry. She grabbed her oversized work jacket, zipped Imani against her chest so tightly she could feel the baby's heartbeat against her own, and stepped out into the freezing rain. The Kang estate was a monument to power and isolation, surrounded by black iron gates and patrolled by men with earpieces and cold eyes. It was a place where secrets were kept and the law didn't apply. Elena scanned her ID at the service entrance, her hands shaking. "Keep quiet, baby," she whispered into the collar of her coat. "Just 1 hour. Then we get the medicine." The interior of the mansion was the labyrinth of white marble and minimalist art. It felt more like a museum than a home. Elena began her work in the east wing, her mop bucket echoing in the hollow silence. She moved like a shadow, avoiding the cameras, her mind racing with the fear of being caught. But as she reached the 3rd floor, she noticed something. The air was getting colder. The heating system in the servant quarters must have failed. Imani began to whimper, a tiny, distressed sound that made Elena's blood run cold. She searched for warmth, moving deeper into the forbidden executive wing. She found it behind a pair of heavy oak doors, a private study where a fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. It was the warmest room she had ever seen. Elena stepped inside, intending to stay only long enough to warm Imani's hands. She sat on the edge of a velvet chair, the firelight dancing on her dark skin. For a moment, the world felt safe. For a moment, she forgot she was a trespasser in the home of a man known for his cruelty. Then the doors behind her swung open. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. The sound of the heavy oak doors hitting the stops was like a gavel coming down on her life. She clutched the 9-month-old bundle against her chest, her heart hammering so hard she feared the man standing behind her could hear it. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. It was the kind of silence that existed just before a storm breaks. "You were assigned to the East Wing," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a terrifying clarity. It was deep, textured like gravel and silk, and carried the weight of a man used to being obeyed without question. Elena slowly stood and turned. Hune Kang stood in the center of the room. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by a faint, jagged scar that disappeared under his watch. At 32, he was the most powerful man in the city, a titan of industry with the eyes of an assassin. He looked at Elena, his gaze sweeping over her worn sneakers and the oversized jacket that looked far too heavy for the room's warmth. Then, his eyes locked onto the small, dark head of the baby peeking out from her collar. I am so sorry, Mr. Kang," Elena whispered. Her voice felt thin, like it might snap at any moment. "The heaters in the back, they weren't working. She's sick. I didn't have anywhere else to go." Hune didn't yell. He didn't call security. He simply stared at Imani. The coldness that usually defined his face shifted, a flicker of something raw and ancient crossing his features. He stepped forward and Elena instinctively flinched, pulling the baby closer. "I won't hurt her," he said. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for Elena to smell the scent of expensive sandalwood and the faint metallic tang of the rain he'd recently stepped out of. "How long has she had the fever?" "Since this morning," Elena said, her eyes stinging. "The sitter canceled. The pipes broke. I just needed to finish my shift so I could buy the medicine. Please don't fire me. We have nowhere else." Hune looked from the desperate mother to the child. Imani, sensing the shift in the air, reached out a tiny, shaky hand toward him. To Elena's horror, the Ice King didn't pull away. He stood perfectly still as the infant's fingers brushed his silk shirt. "She has the same eyes," Hune murmured, so low Elena almost missed it. He looked up, his gaze piercing her. "You are running from someone. A woman with a sick child doesn't look at the door every 5 seconds because she's afraid of being fired. You're afraid of being found." Elena's breath hitched. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me, Elena. I make it my business to know exactly who enters my house. Your name is Elena Vance. You arrived in Oak Haven 6 months ago with no records and a bruised rib. The man you're hiding from, he's powerful, but he isn't me." He walked over to the desk and picked up a heavy glass decanter of water, pouring a glass. He held it out to her. "The storm outside is turning into a blizzard," Hune said, his voice regaining its icy edge. "If you leave now, the child will be in a hospital by midnight, or a morgue by morning. You will stay here, not in the servants' quarters, here, in the main house." "Why?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you help me?" Hune looked at the fireplace, the flames reflecting in his dark pupils. "Because I know what it's like to watch the world take something from you while you stand by helpless. And because I find that I have a sudden use for a woman that the world believes doesn't exist." He turned back to her, his expression unreadable once more. "My housekeeper will bring you clothes and medicine for the girl. From this moment on, you are no longer a cleaner. You are a guest. But understand this, in my world, nothing is free. You will owe me a debt, Elena, and I always collect." The transition from the basement apartment to the master suite of the Kang estate felt like a fever dream. The guest wing was a cathedral of glass and white linen, a place so quiet Elena could hear the soft rhythmic puff of the humidifier the staff had placed by Imani's crib. For 3 days, Elena lived in a state of suspended animation. She ate food she couldn't name brought on silver trays and watched as a private doctor, a man who asked no questions and wore a suit that cost more than Elena's old car, treated Imani's fever with silent efficiency. But the luxury was a thin veil over a world of iron. Elena stood by the tall, reinforced windows of her room, watching the security detail move across the snowy grounds. They weren't just guards, they were soldiers. They moved with a synchronized, lethal grace that reminded her exactly who Hune Kang was. He wasn't just a businessman. He was a man who lived in a state of permanent war. On the 4th night, the silence of the mansion was broken. Elena had stepped out into the hallway to find a kitchen for Imani's bottle. The house was dim, lit only by the blue glow of floor-level security lights. As she passed the heavy mahogany doors of the library, she heard voices. One was Hune's, cold, precise, and vibrating with a suppressed violence. "I don't care about the shipment," Hune snapped. "I care about the leak. If the police found that doc, it's because someone inside the circle whispered. Find them. Bring them to the warehouse. Do not involve the lawyers." Elena froze, the plastic bottle trembling in her hand. She heard the heavy thud of a fist hitting a desk. "And the rival syndicate?" another man asked, a voice she recognized as Min, Hune's shadow-like head of security. "They're moving into the North District. They know you're vulnerable right now. They know the board is looking for a reason to replace you with someone more stable, a family man." "Let them move," Hune replied. "They think they can use my lack of an heir against me. They think a man with nothing to lose is weak. They're about to find out it's the opposite." Elena backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had heard too much. In the stories her mother used to tell, the people who overheard the king's secrets didn't live to see the dawn. She turned to run back to the safety of her room, but as she spun around, she collided with a solid, warm wall of a chest. She gasped, the bottle slipping from her fingers and thudding onto the thick carpet. Hune stood there, framed by the shadows of the hallway. He hadn't even made a sound. He looked down at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. He didn't look angry. He looked predatory, like he had been waiting for her to stumble into his path. "Eavesdropping is a dangerous habit in this house, Elena," he said, his voice a low, silk-wrapped threat. I was just getting water for the baby," she whispered, her back pressing against the cold library door. "I didn't mean to hear anything." Hune stepped closer, invading her space until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He reached out, his hand hovering near her throat, before his fingers brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was electric, a sharp contrast to the ice in his voice. "My associates think I need a wife," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. "They think a family would make me look legitimate to the board. They think it would protect the empire from a hostile takeover." Elena's breath hitched. "What does that have to do with me?" "You're a woman with no past running from a man who represents everything I despise," Hune said. He leaned in, his lips inches from her ear. "And I am a man who needs a distraction. Stay here. Be the wife the world thinks I have. In exchange, I will make sure your ex-husband never draws another breath of air in this city." He pulled back, his eyes searching hers. "A contract, Elena. My protection for your presence. What is your daughter's life worth to you?" The silence that followed his proposal was suffocating. Elena looked at Hune, searching for a sign that this was a cruel joke, but his face remained a mask of obsidian. He wasn't asking for her love. He was proposing a merger. "I'm a cleaner, Mr. Kang," she whispered, her voice finally finding its strength. I don't belong in ballrooms or boardrooms. I don't know how to be the woman you're describing." "I don't need a socialite," Hune replied, his voice dropping an octave. "I need a survivor. And you've survived more than most men in my circle." He reached down, picked up the fallen bottle, and handed it to her. His fingers lingered against hers for a second too long. "Think about it, but do not take too long. My enemies move faster than the winter sun." The next few days were a blur of high-tension domesticity. Elena remained in the guest wing, but the atmosphere had shifted. She was no longer a hidden secret. She was a phantom haunting the hallways. It was 3 a.m. when the nightmare returned. Elena woke with a start, her heart racing. At first, she thought it was the sound of the wind, but then she heard it, a low rhythmic thumping from the floor below. It was the sound of someone hitting a punching bag with enough force to crack bone. Driven by a restless curiosity, she wrapped herself in a silk robe and followed the sound to the mansion's gym. The room was dark, lit only by the pale moon reflecting off the snow outside. Hune was there. He was shirtless, his back a map of muscle and old silver scars that caught the moonlight. He was moving with a savage intensity, his knuckles wrapped in white tape that was already blooming with spots of red. Every strike against the heavy bag sounded like a gunshot. Elena watched from the shadows, mesmerized by the raw, unbridled pain in his movements. This wasn't training, it was an exorcism. Suddenly he stopped. He leaned his forehead against the bag, his chest heaving, sweat dripping from his chin. "You should be sleeping, Elena," he said, his back still turned to her. "I couldn't." She stepped out into the light. "The noise, it sounded like you were trying to kill something that wasn't there." Hune turned slowly. In the dim light, the Ice King looked haunted. "Sometimes the ghosts are harder to kill than the living." He walked toward her, grabbing a towel to wipe his face. He sat on a weight bench, gesturing for her to sit near him. For the first time, the predatory edge was gone, replaced by a hollow exhaustion. "I had a sister," he said abruptly. The confession felt like it had been ripped out of him. "She was 9 months old when the rival syndicates decided my father had grown too powerful. They didn't go for his businesses. They went for the nursery." Elena felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. She thought of Imani, sleeping peacefully upstairs. "I was 10 years old," Hune continued, his eyes fixed on his bloodied knuckles. "I watched them take her. I watched them drive away while I hid in a closet. My father spent millions, killed hundreds, but we never found her, not even a body." He looked up at Elena, and for a split second, she saw the 10-year-old boy who had been left behind in the dark. "When I saw you in that study, clutching your daughter like she was your only heartbeat, I didn't see a trespasser. I saw what I failed to protect 20 years ago." Elena reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on his shoulder. This time, he didn't pull away. He leaned into her touch, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lungs. "I'll do it," she whispered. "I'll be your wife. I'll help you hold your empire." Hune looked at her, his gaze intense. "You realize what this means? If you marry me, my enemies become yours. Marcus will be the least of your worries." "I've lived in fear my whole life, Hune," Elena said, her voice steady. "But I've never had a king standing in front of me. If you provide the shield, I will provide the family." Hune stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "Then the deal is sealed. Tomorrow, the world meets the new Mrs. Kang, and God help anyone who tries to take what belongs to me." The following weeks were a choreographed illusion. Designers, tailors, and tutors flooded the guest wing, transforming Elena from a woman who hid in the shadows into a woman who commanded them. She wore silks, the color of midnight, and diamonds that felt like cold fire against her skin. But beneath the luxury, the tension in the mansion was a living thing, coiled and waiting to strike. Hune was rarely seen during the day, but his presence was everywhere, in the increased security details, the encrypted phones, and the way the servants bowed a little deeper when Elena passed. They were preparing for a war, and Elena was the prize. On a Tuesday afternoon, Elena broke the rules. The confinement of the glass fortress had begun to feel like a gilded cage. She needed air, and more importantly, she needed the specific teething gel that Imani only responded to, a brand the mansion's high-end medical staff didn't stock. Against the advice of her lead guard, she insisted on a quick trip to a pharmacy in the North District. 10 minutes, she told the driver. I'll be in and out. The air outside was biting, the city gray and industrial. Elena stepped out of the black SUV, pulling her wool coat tight. She felt the eyes on her before she saw the man. It was a prickle at the base of her neck, a familiar, sickening dread she had hoped was buried. She hurried into the pharmacy, her heels clicking on the linoleum. As she reached for the shelf, a hand, heavy, calloused, and smelling of cheap tobacco, clamped over her wrist. "Found you, Elle." The voice was a jagged blade. Elena froze, her blood turning to slush. She turned slowly to see Marcus. He looked worse than she remembered, eyes bloodshot, jaw covered in a week's growth of stubble, and a desperation that made him look feral. "Marcus," she breathed, her voice failing. "You thought you could hide in a billionaire's tower." Marcus sneered, his grip tightening until Elena's bones groaned. "You thought you could take my daughter and just disappear. I've been watching those gates for weeks. You're coming with me. Right now." "Let me go, Marcus. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I don't care about some suit in a penthouse," Marcus hissed, dragging her toward the back exit of the pharmacy. "I'm the father. I have rights, and if you don't come quiet, I'll make sure the whole world knows what kind of wife you really are." He shoved her into the alleyway behind the building. The cold air hit her face, and for a second Elena saw her life ending in the grime of a New York side street. Marcus raised his hand, the same hand that had left bruises on her ribs a year ago. "Stop." The word wasn't a shout. It was a vibration that seemed to come from the pavement itself. At the end of the alley stood Hune. He was alone, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his long black overcoat. He looked out of place in the filth of the alley, like a god who had descended into a sewer. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus yelled, letting go of Elena to reach for a heavy iron pipe leaning against a dumpster. Hune didn't answer. He walked forward, his pace steady, his eyes locked on Marcus with a terrifying predatory focus. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like the monster the underworld whispered about. "You're the one who laid hands on her," Hune said softly. It wasn't a question. Marcus swung the pipe with a desperate cry. Hune didn't flinch. In a movement so fast Elena's eyes could barely track it. He stepped inside the arc of the swing. He caught Marcus's wrist with one hand and slammed a palm into his chest with the other. The sound of Marcus hitting the brick wall was sickening. Hune didn't stop. He pinned Marcus by the throat, his fingers digging into the man's windpipe. "You survived this long because I allowed it," Hune whispered, his face inches from Marcus's. "I wanted to see if you were a threat or just a nuisance. You just gave me my answer." "Please," Marcus wheezed, his eyes bulging. "If I ever see your shadow within 10 miles of my family again," Hune said, his voice dropping to a terrifying gravelly depth. "I won't kill you. I will make you wish for death every hour of every day for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand?" He dropped Marcus like a sack of trash. Marcus scrambled away, tripping over his own feet as he vanished into the fog of the city. Hune turned to Elena. His breathing wasn't even labored. Walked to her, his expression softening just enough for her to see the man beneath the mask. He reached out, his thumb gently brushing a tear from her cheek. "I told you, Elena," he said, his voice thick with a new, dark possessiveness. "No one touches what belongs to me." The drive back to the estate was silent, but it wasn't the cold silence of strangers. Hune sat close to Elena, his hand resting on the seat between them, close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his skin. The violence she had witnessed in the alley should have terrified her, but as she looked at the man who had dismantled her past without breaking a sweat, she felt a profound, heavy sense of peace. Back inside the fortress of the master suite, the adrenaline finally faded, leaving Elena trembling. She went straight to the nursery, needing to feel the reality of her daughter's safety. Imani was sitting up in her crib, playing with a small plush lion that Hune had left there the night before. When she saw Elena, she let out a shriek of joy, her little legs kicking against the mattress. "I've got you, baby," Elena whispered, lifting the 9-month-old and pressing her face into the infant's neck. "We're safe, I promise." A shadow fell across the doorway. Hune was standing there, his tie loosened, watching them with an expression that made Elena's heart ache. He looked like a man standing on the outside of a room he desperately wanted to enter, but didn't know how to ask for permission. "She's fine, Elena," he said softly. Imani turned her head at the sound of his voice. Her big dark eyes lit up, and she reached out both of her chubby arms toward the tall man in the doorway. She bounced in Elena's grip, a series of urgent babbles falling from her lips. "Pa! Pa! Pa!" The sound was small, but in the quiet of the nursery, it hit like a thunderclap. Elena froze. Hune's entire body went rigid. The man who could stare down a rival syndicate without blinking looked like he had been struck. He didn't move for a long time, his gaze fixed on the child who had just given him a title he never thought he'd earn. Slowly, as if he were approaching a wild animal that might flee, Hune stepped into the room. He reached out, and Imani practically lunged into his arms. He tucked her against his broad chest, his large hand supporting her head with a tenderness that brought tears to Elena's eyes. He didn't say a word. He just closed his eyes and buried his face in the baby's hair, a single jagged breath escaping his lungs. In that moment, the Ice King was gone. There was only a man who had finally found a reason to breathe. "She knows," Elena whispered, stepping closer to him. "She knows you're the one who keeps the monsters away." Hune looked at Elena, his eyes glassy. I didn't think I was allowed to have this." He leaned down, his forehead resting against Elena's. For a few minutes, the world outside, the threats, the empire, the blood, didn't exist. They were just 3 souls forming a circle that nothing could break. But the peace was a lie. Later that night, Elena was in the kitchen, preparing a late-night tea. She heard a heavy thud from the hallway, followed by the sound of glass shattering. She ran toward the sound, her heart leaping into her throat. She found Hune collapsed against the marble console table in the foyer. A crystal vase lay in pieces around him. He was clutching his head, his face contorted in an agony so sharp it made him look unrecognizable. "Hune," Elena cried, dropping to her knees beside him. He tried to speak, his hand reaching for her, but his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp in her arms. "Min, help!" Elena screamed, her voice echoing through the hollow halls of the mansion. The household erupted into chaos. Within minutes, the private medical team was there, whisking Hune away to the sterile, hidden clinic in the basement. Elena was left standing in the foyer, her hands stained with the water from the broken vase, the silence of the house now feeling like a shroud. Hours later, the lead doctor emerged. He didn't look like a man with good news. He led Elena into a private office and closed the door. "Mr. Kang has been hiding his condition for months," the doctor said, his voice flat and clinical. "It's a glioblastoma, an aggressive tumor at the base of the brain. He refused treatment because he wanted to finish the restructuring of the company first." Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. "What are you saying? Is he going to be okay?" The doctor looked at her with a heavy, professional pity. "He's a strong man, but even he can't fight biology. Without a miracle, he has less than 6 months. He woke up a few minutes ago. He wants to see you." Elena walked into the clinic room, her legs feeling like lead. Hune was propped up in the bed, looking smaller than she had ever seen him, wires and monitors tethering him to the world. He looked at her, a pale shadow of the man who had saved her in the alley. "Don't cry, Elena," he rasped, reaching out a shaky hand. "I've known for a long time. I just didn't realize I'd finally find a reason to want to stay until it was too late." He pulled her closer, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "We need to move the wedding up. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die knowing you and Imani are the most powerful women in this city. You need my name, Elena. You need it to survive what comes next." The wedding was not the gala the city expected. There were no photographers, no prying eyes, and no celebratory champagne. It took place in the grand library of the estate, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the sterile, sharp tang of medicine. Hune stood by the fireplace. Supported by a cane, he tried to hide behind the folds of his charcoal suit. He was pale, but his eyes were like burning coals, fixed entirely on Elena as she walked toward him. She wore a dress of ivory silk, simple and elegant, but her hands trembled as she held a small bouquet of white roses. Imani sat nearby in a high chair, dressed in a lace gown, oblivious to the fact that her future was being sealed in blood and ink. "By the power vested in me," the private judge began, his voice echoing in the vast room. The vows were short. They were a contract, a transfer of power. But when it came time for Hune to speak, he leaned in, his voice a low, raspy velvet that only Elena could hear. "I give you my name, my life, and every weapon I own," he whispered. "I leave you with a kingdom, Elena. Promise me you'll never let them see you blink." "I promise," she choked out, the weight of the gold band on her finger feeling like a mountain. The moment the papers were signed, Hune's strength flickered. He slumped into a leather chair, his breathing shallow. The doctors moved in like shadows, but he waved them off, his gaze still on Elena. "Leave us," he commanded. The room cleared, leaving the three of them in the flickering firelight. For the first time, Elena didn't feel like a guest or a servant. She felt like a queen sitting in a crumbling castle. The weeks that followed were a blur of desperate intimacy. Hune was dying, and they both knew it. Every meal, every conversation, every look was charged with the electricity of a countdown. Elena moved her things into his suite, not because the contract required it, but because she couldn't bear the thought of him being alone in the dark. She became his hands when they shook too much to hold a pen. She became his voice when the pain made it hard to speak. And in the quiet hours of the night, they talked. He told her about the gardens in Jeju he missed, and she told her about the dreams she had buried in the projects. I spent 30 years building a fortress to keep people out, Hune said one night, his head resting in her lap as she stroked his hair. I didn't realize I was just building a cage for a man who had forgotten how to love. You aren't in a cage anymore, Elena whispered, leaning down to kiss his forehead. But as they grew closer, the world outside grew more dangerous. The news of Hune's sudden marriage and his declining health had reached the ears of the rival syndicates. They smelled blood in the water. One evening, while Elena was reading a report to Hune, his head of security, Min, burst into the room. His face was grim. "They're here, sir. A friend from the past is at the gate. She claims to have information that could invalidate the marriage. She's demanding to speak with the new Mrs. Kang." Elena felt a cold spike of dread. She knew that voice before the woman even entered the room. It was Chloe, her former co-worker from the cleaning agency, the one woman who knew exactly where Elena had come from and just how much she was hiding. Chloe walked into the room, her eyes darting around the luxury with a naked, poisonous greed. She looked at Elena, then at the dying king in the bed, and a smirk stretched across her face. "Well, well," Chloe sneered. The maid finally cleaned up her act. "But tell me, Mr. Kang, does your board of directors know that your new wife is a fugitive? Does the law know she's technically still married to a man she ran away from?" Elena stood up, her heart hammering. But before she could speak, she felt Hune's hand grip hers. It was cold, but the strength in it was undeniable. "She is my wife," Hune said, his voice regaining that terrifying lethal edge. "And in this house, my word is the only law that exists. Min, take our guest to the garden. I believe she needs to see how we handle weeds." "You can't do this," Chloe screamed as the guards grabbed her arms. "I have proof. I'll tell everyone." "The world only hears what I allow it to hear," Hune replied, his eyes narrowing. "And you're about to become a very quiet memory." As Chloe was dragged out, Elena collapsed back onto the bed, trembling. "She's right, Hune. My past, it's going to destroy everything you've built." "No," Hune said, pulling her face down to his. "Your past is dead. I killed it the moment I put that ring on your finger. Now we focus on the future. There's a specialist in Germany. They sent me a file today. A new trial. Hope is a dangerous thing, but in that moment it was the only thing Elena had left to hold on to. The days that followed were the darkest Elena had ever known. Hune's strength was fading like a guttering candle. He spent most of his time in a medically induced sleep, his breathing assisted by a machine that hissed in the silence of the suite. Elena never left his side, her world reduced to the four walls of the room and the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Then the call came. Min burst into the room, clutching an encrypted satellite phone. "It's the clinic in Berlin, ma'am. The lead pathologist. He says it's urgent." Elena took the phone with trembling hands. The voice on the other end was frantic, speaking in a thick German accent. "We have been rerunning the biopsy samples sent from Oakhaven. There has been a catastrophic error in the local lab's labeling process. Mr. Kang's samples were swapped with a patient from the oncology ward who passed away last week." Elena's heart stopped. "What? What are you saying?" "The inflammation in Mr. Kang's brain is not a glioblastoma," the doctor shouted over the static. "It is a rare but treatable parasitic infection likely contracted during his last trip to Southeast Asia. It causes identical shadowing on an MRI, but it is not terminal. If you start the aggressive antibiotic protocol I am emailing now, he will recover. He is not dying, Mrs. Kang. He is just very, very sick." Elena dropped the phone, a sound that was half laugh and half sob tearing from her throat. She threw herself onto the bed, grabbing Ji-hoon's limp hand and pressing it to her tear-stained cheek. "You hear that?" she whispered, her voice thick with relief. "You're not leaving us. You don't get to leave us." The recovery was slow, but it was a miracle to behold. As the infection cleared, the Ice King returned, but he was different. The man who woke up 2 weeks later didn't have the same cold void in his eyes. He looked at Elena and Imani with a hunger for life that no empire could satisfy. 1 year later, the glass fortress was no longer a tomb. The heavy black drapes had been replaced with sheer linen that let the sunlight pour into every corner. The sound of high-stakes crime whispered in the hallways had been replaced by the steady, confident gait of a toddler learning to run. Ji-hoon stood in the center of the Vant Group boardroom. The director sat in stunned silence as he laid a final set of documents on the table. "As of today," Ji-hoon announced, his voice echoing with its old power, "Vant Group is divesting from all gray market holdings. We are pivoting entirely to the Kang Foundation's initiatives, urban renewal, housing for single mothers, and pediatric health care. If any of you have an issue with a legitimate, clean future, the exit is behind you." No one moved. They knew better than to challenge a man who had literally returned from the grave. The story ended where it had truly begun, in the garden. Elena sat on a bench, a textbook in her lap as she finished her final year of her architecture degree. She watched as Ji-hoon, dressed in a simple sweater and jeans, chased a giggling 18-month-old Imani through the sprinklers. He caught her, lifting her high into the air as the sun caught the gold of his wedding band. He walked over to Elena, setting the child down to play in the grass, and pulled his wife into a deep, lingering kiss. "I used to think the world was a game of shadows," Ji-hoon whispered against her lips. "I thought I had to be the biggest monster to survive it." Elena smiled, tracing the line of his jaw. "And now?" Ji-hoon looked at his daughter, then back at the woman who had saved him with nothing but a mop and a mother's heart. "Now," he said, "I realize the only thing worth building is a home." Elena had entered the glass fortress as a ghost, a woman running from a nightmare. But in the arms of a king who learned to be a man, she found a reality more beautiful than any dream. Because sometimes, the person who saves you isn't a hero in a white cape. It's the monster who decides to build a world just to keep you safe. If this journey moved you, don't forget to like and comment. Legacy below to let us know you made it to the end. Subscribe for more epic stories of love and redemption. Until next time.